He said I was unfit to be a mother, that I was too tired, too distracted, too weak to raise my own daughter. I sat there in that courtroom listening to the man who once held my hand twist the truth into something sharp enough to cut me. He looked so sure of himself, so calm in his lies, while his lawyers spoke as if they had practiced every word together. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I just kept thinking, how did we get here? How did love turn into this? I thought the pain would crush me, but then I saw her, sitting so small yet steady, her eyes locked on me like she knew something no one else did. That day, I didn't speak much, because I didn't need to. The truth was already in the room, waiting for its moment to be heard. Thank you so much for watching with me tonight. It truly means more than you can imagine. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know. My name is Mary, and I live here in Ohio, where the mornings are quiet and the air always smells a little like rain after it's been cold for too long. I've lived in the same small house for almost 20 years now, a house that once felt so full of laughter and the sound of little feet running down the hall. I remember planting roses in the backyard the year we moved in, thinking they would grow alongside our family, believing that home meant safety and that love, once promised, stayed steady like the walls that held us. I was wrong, but I didn't know it then. I worked nights at the care home, long hours, sometimes double shifts, because someone had to keep the lights on. I came home tired but proud, knowing that I was doing my best. He used to say he understood, used to smile when I'd kiss him goodnight before heading out the door, but somewhere along the way, his smile stopped reaching his eyes. I began to notice how he'd flinch when I talked about work, how he'd leave the room whenever I tried to tell him about my day. I thought maybe he was stressed, that maybe life had just gotten heavier for both of us. But what I didn't see was that while I was out working to keep us together, he was quietly pulling us apart. People always say, love dies slowly. But in my case, it died in silence, in all the moments when I didn't ask enough questions, when I believed his sighs were just exhaustion, not resentment. Still, I held on, because when you've shared a life, you don't just walk away at the first storm. I wanted my daughter to have both of us, to see what family was supposed to look like, even if I had to hold it together by myself. I remember one evening, coming home after a long shift, my hands still smelling like disinfectant and coffee, and finding him sitting at the table, staring at nothing. He didn't even look up when I said his name. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know that night was the beginning of a story I would never forget. That night, when I found him sitting at the table, I remember how the kitchen light seemed too bright, how his face looked like stone while the clock ticked so loud it felt like time itself was waiting for something to break. I asked if he was all right, but he didn't look up, just said, "I'm fine," and kept staring at the empty plate in front of him. I stood there, not sure whether to reach out or walk away, and in that silence I felt something close, something small but final. For years, I had been trying to keep us together, thinking love could be fixed if I worked hard enough. But that night, I realized I was the only one still holding on. I started to notice things after that, little signs that made no sense at first. His late nights became longer, the calls he took outside became more frequent, and when I'd ask who it was, he'd just shrug and say, "Work." I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than facing what my heart already knew. But even our daughter began to sense it, asking me once why Daddy didn't laugh anymore, why he left before breakfast and came home after she was asleep. I didn't know how to answer. I kept telling myself that families go through rough patches, that we'd find our way back, but the distance between us only grew wider. I began sleeping on one side of the bed, untouched and cold. And when I'd wake up, he was already gone. I remember one morning, standing at the sink washing the same cup over and over, and thinking how strange it was that something so simple could feel like the last piece of normal left. I tried to talk to him, tried to make him remember the life we built. The nights we used to whisper dreams into the dark, but all he said was, "You're too tired all the time, Mary, too distracted to be a real partner." And that sentence cut deeper than anything he had ever said. I didn't know that those words were only the beginning, that soon he would take that same idea into a courtroom and call it truth. But even as everything started to fall apart, I still believed that if I just stayed patient, if I just kept loving him quietly, somehow love would notice and come home again. I was wrong, and I learned that some people don't leave with their feet. They leave with their hearts long before they pack a single bag. It all began to unravel one evening in early spring, when the air outside still carried that cold bite, and the rain fell just enough to make the windows hum. I had just come home from another long shift, my back aching, my shoes damp, and as soon as I stepped into the house, I knew something was different. The lights were on, but the silence was heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I called his name softly, but no answer came. When I walked into the living room, I saw a briefcase on the table, a folder inside it, and his jacket draped neatly over the chair. Beside it, there was a glass of whiskey half empty and his phone buzzing quietly. I didn't mean to look, but when the screen lit up, I saw her name, one I didn't recognize. The message read, "You handled it perfectly today. She'll never see it coming." For a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. I sat down slowly, staring at those words, and the room began to tilt, the kind of dizziness that comes not from spinning too fast, but from realizing your world has already shifted beneath you. I waited for him to come home that night, waited for an explanation that would make it all make sense. But when he finally walked through the door, he just smiled like nothing was wrong. I wanted to confront him, to scream, to demand why he was tearing our life apart piece by piece. But I didn't. I asked him if he'd eaten, and he said no, then went straight to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. That was the night I realized love can coexist with fear, that sometimes silence is the only thing keeping you from breaking in half. The next morning, I woke to find papers on the kitchen counter. At first, I thought they were bills, but when I looked closer, my hands began to shake. It was a petition for divorce, my name written beside words like unfit and unstable, accusations I didn't even know how to defend because they weren't real. He walked in just as I was reading, calm as if he were asking about the weather, and said, "It's better this way, Mary. It's time we face the truth." I wanted to ask whose truth he meant, but I couldn't find the strength. All I could do was stand there and watch the man I once built a life with turn into a stranger wearing his face. The days after that blurred together, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. I tried to keep my head above water, to keep working, to keep feeding and comforting the little one who still thought both her parents would be there forever. But inside, I was unraveling. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after she went to bed, staring at the legal papers and thinking, maybe if I just let him win, maybe if I just walk away, she won't have to see us destroy each other. But every time I looked at her sleeping face, I knew I couldn't. I wasn't fighting for pride. I was fighting for the right to love her without fear, to protect her from the lies he was wrapping her in. Still, when the first hearing came and I stood in front of that judge, I had never felt so small. His lawyer spoke of things that never happened, twisting every part of my life into something ugly. I could feel my hands tremble as they called me distracted, overworked, emotionally unbalanced. I wanted to speak, to explain, but every word in my throat turned into a knot. He didn't even look at me, not once. Not when they said I was a danger to my own child, not when I tried to meet his eyes. After that day, I stopped trying to make him understand. I stopped searching for the man I married. Because what sat across from me in that courtroom wasn't love anymore. It was ambition, cruelty dressed in charm. And I realized that some people don't just want to win the argument, they want to erase the other person completely. But what he didn't know was that truth, no matter how long it hides, always has a way of walking into the room at the right time. And when it does, it doesn't whisper, it stands tall, even if it comes from the smallest voice. The morning after that first hearing, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor for a long time, wondering how everything had turned into such a cruel performance. I had always believed that truth spoke for itself, that goodness had its own quiet power. But in that courtroom, truth felt small and outnumbered. His lawyers had painted me like a stranger to my own home, calling me unstable, calling my long hours neglect instead of sacrifice. I kept hearing those words even after I left, each one echoing like a bruise I couldn't see. I tried to eat, but food turned to dust in my mouth, so I made coffee instead and stood by the window watching the clouds roll past. My daughter was coloring at the table, humming softly, unaware of the storm I was standing in. When she looked up and smiled, I almost broke. I smiled back, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was terrified. Days passed in slow motion after that. He called sometimes not to talk, but to threaten, to remind me how powerful his lawyers were, how easy it would be to take her away if I didn't cooperate. I'd hang up and sit in the dark, praying for strength, praying that someone would see through the lies before it was too late. Every night I'd tuck her in and promise that everything would be okay, even though I didn't believe it myself. She'd ask, "Will you be there tomorrow?" And I'd nod, because what else could I say? One night, I heard her small footsteps coming down the hall, and when I turned, she was holding her tablet close to her chest. She didn't say much, just asked if she could sleep beside me. I lifted the blanket, and she curled up quietly, resting her head against my arm. Before she drifted off, she whispered, "Mommy, I know you're not bad." And that's when I realized she had seen more than I thought. I didn't know what she meant at the time, didn't know what she was holding on to so tightly, but something in her voice made me feel that maybe, somehow she had a plan that even I couldn't see yet. The days leading up to the next court date felt endless, a mix of fear and hope that shifted with every sunrise. I didn't know how to fight anymore, but I knew I had to stand there one last time, not for me, but for her. And as the date grew closer, she became quieter, more watchful, almost as if she was waiting for her moment to speak when the world was ready to listen. The morning of the second hearing, I woke up before the sun and sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing from the next room. My hands were cold, even though the air wasn't, and no matter how many times I told myself to stay calm, my heart wouldn't listen. I dressed slowly, made her breakfast, and watched as she ate without saying much. There was a look in her eyes that I couldn't quite read, something steady and older than her years, but I didn't ask questions. Sometimes when you've lived through too many storms, you learn that silence carries more meaning than words ever could. When we arrived at the courthouse, everything felt heavier than before. His lawyers were already there, shuffling papers, rehearsing their performance like it was theater instead of truth. He stood near them, polished and confident, the same smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth that used to make me feel safe, but now only reminded me of how well a liar can wear calmness as a disguise. I tried not to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me, measuring every breath I took. I sat down, held my daughter's hand, and whispered that everything would be fine, even though I had no proof that it would be. The judge walked in and the air shifted. Everyone rose, and then it began again. The accusations, the twisting of my life into something I could barely recognize. They spoke about my late nights at work, my exhaustion, my supposed neglect, each word cutting deeper until I felt hollow. I tried to focus on my breathing, to remember why I was there. Then suddenly, she let go of my hand and stood up. I turned to her, but before I could say anything, she stepped forward, her small voice rising above the noise, steady and sure. She looked at the judge and said, "Can I show you something Daddy doesn't know?" The room fell silent. Even his lawyers stopped mid-sentence. The judge looked surprised, then nodded gently. I felt every muscle in my body tighten as she lifted her tablet with both hands. I didn't know what she was about to do, but something deep inside me told me that whatever came next would change everything. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft but curious, and told her to go ahead. She walked slowly toward the bench, her little hands trembling as she unlocked the tablet, and for a second, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint tapping of her fingers against the screen. I wanted to stop her, to ask what she was doing. But my voice wouldn't come. I just sat there, frozen, watching her courage take shape right in front of me. When she pressed play, the room filled with a sound I had hoped never to hear again. His voice. Angry, sharp, echoing through the speakers like thunder trapped in a bottle. He was shouting, slamming doors, breaking dishes, his words cruel and twisted. I watched the judge's face change, watched the lawyers glance at each other, and I could feel the tension ripple through the room like a wave. Then came the part that broke me. The video shifted, and there she was, hiding under the table, whispering softly to herself, saying, "It's okay? Mommy's not bad, Daddy's just angry again." That small voice shattered whatever strength I had left, but I stayed still, holding on to the armrest so tightly my knuckles ached. The judge raised a hand and stopped the video, her expression heavy with disbelief and quiet anger. She turned toward him and said in a calm, measured tone, "Sir, I suggest you stop speaking for the rest of this hearing." He tried to say something, his voice cracking, but no one wanted to listen anymore. The truth had spoken for itself, raw and undeniable. I looked at my daughter, standing there with her tablet, and for the first time in months, I saw peace in her eyes. Not victory, not pride, just peace. And I realized in that moment that sometimes justice doesn't need shouting or revenge. Sometimes it walks into the room quietly, carried by the hands of someone who believes in love more than fear. For a long moment after the judge spoke, no one moved, not even him. The weight of silence filled the room so completely that it felt like time itself had stopped to listen. I sat there, my heart pounding, watching as his confidence cracked right there in front of everyone. He looked smaller somehow, not because of what anyone said, but because the mask he had worn for so long finally slipped. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, papers rustling without purpose. And the judge's voice broke the stillness again, calm but firm, saying that no further statements were necessary. I wanted to breathe, but it felt like I'd forgotten how. When the gavel finally struck, the sound echoed through the courtroom like thunder rolling through a valley, and for the first time, it didn't scare me. It was the sound of an ending, one I had waited for but never dared to imagine would come. I turned to look at my daughter, and she was staring at me, her eyes wide but steady. And in that moment, we didn't need words. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken through her bravery. She reached out her hand, and I took it, holding on like it was the only solid thing in the world. As we stood to leave, I glanced at him one last time. He couldn't look at me. His head was bowed, his jaw tight, the man who once thought he could control every part of my life, now sitting in the ruins of his own lies. I didn't feel anger, not even satisfaction, just a deep, quiet sadness for what we used to be. But beneath that sadness was something stronger, something that felt like freedom. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the world itself had exhaled. I remember the way the sunlight touched her hair, the way she smiled up at me and said softly, "Can we go home now?" Those words, so simple, felt like the start of everything new. I nodded, and as we walked to the car, I realized that we hadn't just won a case. We had reclaimed something far greater. The right to live without fear, and the peace that comes when truth finally finds its way into the light. The drive home that day felt like stepping into a new world, one where the air didn't taste like fear anymore. She sat beside me quietly, her tablet resting on her lap, and every now and then she'd look out the window like she was trying to understand what freedom really looked like. I wanted to say something, to tell her how proud I was, but my throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. So instead, I just reached over and took her hand, holding it the way I used to when she was small, when everything between us was still safe and whole. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different somehow. Smaller maybe, but softer too. We went inside, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like home again. That evening, she helped me make dinner. The kitchen smelled like garlic and bread, and the sound of her laughter filled the space that had been empty for too long. She asked if I was happy now, and I told her yes, not because everything was perfect, but because peace had finally come back to us in pieces we could hold. After she went to bed, I sat alone at the table, the same table where I had once cried over those divorce papers, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the night, not to anyone in particular, just to life, for not giving up on me even when I almost did. The days that followed were slow but kind. Mornings started with pancakes and sunlight instead of arguments and slammed doors. Laughter replaced tension, and sleep came easier. I didn't check the mail expecting bad news anymore, and I didn't jump when the phone rang. The storm had passed, and though it left its marks, it also left a strange kind of beauty, the kind that only comes after everything you've built has been tested and still stands. Sometimes she'd sit beside me on the porch steps with her tablet, scrolling quietly, and I'd catch her smiling at nothing. I knew she still kept those recordings, not out of anger, but as proof that even in her small hands, truth had power. And as I watched her grow lighter with each day, I realized that the real victory wasn't just winning the case. It was learning that even in the darkest moments, love, steady, honest love, can still find a way to rise. Weeks passed, and with each sunrise, the weight on my chest grew lighter. I started waking up before her again, standing by the window with a cup of tea, watching the morning light spill across the yard. The air outside felt calmer, and the house carried a peace it hadn't known in years. I didn't rush anymore. I took my time folding laundry, humming to the sound of the washing machine, letting quiet moments remind me that survival isn't just about breathing. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you had to hide. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking of him, not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of distance, as if he belonged to another lifetime entirely. One afternoon, he showed up unannounced. I heard the knock and froze, my hand still on the counter. When I opened the door, he looked smaller, older, like the truth had taken more from him than he expected. He tried to smile, said he wanted to talk, said he wanted to see her. I let him speak, standing in the doorway with my arms folded, the wind carrying every pause between his words. He talked about mistakes, about regret, about not knowing who he was back then. I listened quietly, and for a moment I could almost see the man he used to be, but only almost. When he asked if we could start over, I shook my head and said gently, "We already did, just not together." He looked down, nodded slowly, and walked away. I closed the door softly, leaned against it, and let out a long breath. I didn't know I'd been holding. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop trying to fix what's already gone. That evening, as I watched her draw at the table, the same table that once held papers and pain, I realized we didn't need an apology to move on. We had already done the hardest part. We healed. And when she looked up at me and smiled, I smiled back because for the first time in a long time, everything truly felt right. That night, after she went to sleep, I sat by the window with the lights off, letting the moonlight spill across the floor. Everything was still, and in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: quiet pride. Not the loud kind that comes from victory, but the soft kind that grows out of surviving what should have broken you. I thought about everything we had been through, all the nights I cried quietly into my pillow, the mornings I went to work pretending I wasn't falling apart, and how somehow, through it all, love had been the one thing that refused to give up. It was love that kept me standing in that courtroom. Love that gave my daughter the courage to speak when I couldn't. Love that pulled us both out of the wreckage and taught us that truth doesn't need noise, it only needs light. I remembered the woman I used to be before the lies, before the fear, and realized she had never really disappeared. She was just waiting for me to find her again. Sometimes strength doesn't come from fighting. It comes from staying gentle in a world that wants to make you hard. And that was what I learned. Gentleness isn't weakness. It's power that knows when to be quiet. I smiled to myself watching the trees sway outside, thinking about how far we had come from that first day in court. We didn't have everything, but we had peace, and that was enough. Before I went to bed, I peeked into her room one last time. She was fast asleep, her tablet still on the nightstand, the same one that had changed everything. I walked over, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and whispered, "You were braver than anyone knew." She stirred a little, smiled in her sleep, and I knew then that no matter what came next, we would be fine. Life had tried to tear us apart, but love had quietly stitched us back together, one truth at a time. The next morning felt softer than the ones before, as if the world itself was finally catching its breath with me. The light coming through the curtains painted the walls in gold, and for the first time in years, I didn't wake up dreading what the day might bring. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, the same table that had witnessed every stage of my heartbreak, and realized it now held peace instead of pain. She came into the kitchen still half asleep, her hair messy, her face warm with that easy smile she always had before life got complicated. She climbed onto the chair beside me, and I asked if she slept well. She nodded and said she dreamed of us laughing in the garden again, the one with the roses I planted the year we moved in. Hearing that made me laugh softly, the kind of laugh that feels like a small healing in your chest. That day we spent the afternoon baking cookies, the kind we used to make when things were simple. The smell filled the house, and it carried memories I thought I had lost forever. She spilled flour everywhere, and I pretended to be upset just to see her laugh harder. And in that moment, I realized something I had almost forgotten. Joy doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Sometimes, it's messy, quiet, and covered in flour. But it's still joy. Later, after we finished cleaning up, she sat by the window watching the sunset, and I stood behind her, taking in the way her small frame seemed stronger somehow. Everything we had gone through had left marks, but they weren't scars. They were reminders of how far love can stretch before it breaks, and how it still finds a way to hold on. That night, when she fell asleep, I sat at her bedside and whispered a promise to myself that I would never let fear live in this house again. I looked around and saw not what we had lost, but what we had rebuilt. Trust, peace, and a love that had been tested but refused to die. I understood then that sometimes life doesn't give you what you ask for. It gives you what you need to grow, and though the path had been painful, it led us exactly where we were meant to be. Time passed quietly after that, and with each season, our lives began to bloom again. The roses in the garden grew taller, their petals brighter, as if they too had survived something and were proud to show it. Sometimes I'd stand outside with my hands in the soil, feeling the earth between my fingers, grateful for everything that tried to bury me but instead taught me how to rise. Inside the house, laughter had found its way back into every corner, filling spaces that once held silence and fear. I still kept the papers from the trial locked away, not out of anger, but as a reminder of how far truth can travel when love leads the way. She was growing fast, stronger each day, and when I'd watch her run across the yard, I'd see the same courage that saved us both. Life became gentle again. Not perfect, but honest. Some evenings we'd sit together watching the sunset fade behind the trees, and she'd lean her head on my shoulder, whispering that she loved our small, quiet life. And I'd smile, because after everything, peace wasn't just something we found, it was something we built. We didn't need anyone's approval anymore, only the calm that comes from knowing we made it through. And now, as I sit here sharing this with you, I hope you remember that no matter how dark things get, truth always finds its voice, and love, when it's real, never stops fighting. Thank you for staying with me till the end of my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe, share it with someone who needs a little light today. And remember, even the quietest strength can change everything.